I was born in the winter of 1849 in Pennsylvania. My father was a small shopkeeper. My mother did sewing work for neighbors, and we lived modestly but with enough comfort in a town where everyone knew each other, and life moved in steady, predictable ways. I had 3 brothers and 1 sister. My sister died of fever when she was 7 years old. My oldest brother took over the shop after my father passed away. My middle brother moved to Ohio and married there. My youngest brother, Thomas, was born in 1853, 4 years after me. We were close as children, closer than I was with my other brothers. Thomas was adventurous while I was careful, bold while I was cautious. He talked all the time about going west, about claiming land, about building something greater than what Pennsylvania could offer. I married in 1868 at the age of 19 to a man named Henry Morton. Henry was a clerk in my brother's shop, a quiet man who worked steadily and saved carefully. We planned to stay in Pennsylvania, to raise a family, and live the same kind of life my parents had lived. But Henry died of pneumonia in January of 1870, only 4 months after we were married. We had no children. I was 19 years old, and suddenly a widow with no clear prospects and no future that I could see. Thomas was 17 then, working in the shop, but constantly dreaming about the West. He came to me in the spring of 1870 and told me he was going to Kansas. He said he planned to file a homestead claim and build a farm on the free land the government was offering to settlers. He said I should come with him. He said I had nothing left in Pennsylvania now that Henry was gone. He told me that staying would mean depending on family charity for the rest of my life, while going west could mean owning my own land and building my own future. He said if I came with him and helped him prove up his claim, he would later help me file my own claim on land beside his. He said we would be neighbors and help each other. We would build farms side by side and prosper together. I did not want to go. I wanted to remain in Pennsylvania where life was familiar and settled. But Thomas was right that I had no real future there. A widow at 19 with no children and no property had very limited choices. I could live with my oldest brother and his wife and work for my keep, slowly growing old while depending on the goodwill of family. Or I could travel west with Thomas and try to build something of my own. I chose to go west. I wish now that I had chosen differently. We left Pennsylvania in May of 1870. Thomas had saved enough money for a wagon, supplies, and the cost of travel. We joined a small group heading toward Kansas. We traveled through Ohio, Illinois, and Missouri, and finally reached Kansas in late June. Thomas had already selected land from a map, 160 acres in north-central Kansas, good prairie land with access to water. We filed Thomas's homestead claim in early July of 1870. Under the law, Thomas had to live on the land and improve it for 5 years before he could own it outright. During those 5 years, he needed to build a house, break the prairie sod, plant crops, and maintain continuous residence. After 5 years, he could file final proof, and the land would legally become his. Thomas's plan was that I would help him during those 5 years. I would keep the house, help with planting and harvesting, and manage the domestic work while he handled the heavier farming tasks. After those 5 years, once his claim was secure, I would file my own claim on the neighboring quarter section. By then, I would have experience with frontier farming, would have saved some money from our shared work, and would have Thomas's help in establishing my own farm. It was a good plan. It would have worked if Thomas had kept his word. We built a sod house that first summer. We broke 15 acres of prairie and planted a small crop of wheat and corn. The work was brutal. The summer heat was crushing, the prairie seemed endless, and the isolation was overwhelming, but we managed. Thomas and I worked side by side, and by autumn we had a functioning homestead. The first winter was difficult. Our sod house was cold and damp, our supplies were barely enough, and our nearest neighbor lived 5 miles away, but we survived. Spring arrived, and we planted more acres, and the homestead began to look as if it might truly become a successful farm. In the summer of 1871, a year after we arrived, things started to change. Thomas met a woman at a settlement social gathering. Her name was Sarah Bennett. She was 20 years old and the daughter of a well-established farmer who lived 10 miles from our claim. Sarah was pretty, lively, and came from a family that already had money and land. Thomas was completely taken with her, almost immediately. He courted her through that summer and autumn. He rode to the Bennett farm every Sunday. He spent less and less time on our homestead and talked constantly about Sarah, her family, and their prosperous farm. At first I was happy for him. Thomas deserved happiness. He deserved a wife and a family of his own. But as autumn turned into winter, I began to realize what Sarah Bennett might mean for me. Thomas married Sarah in December of 1871, 18 months after we had arrived in Kansas. The wedding took place at the Bennett farm. It was a large celebration with people from all the nearby settlements attending. I was there. I congratulated my brother, smiled politely, and wished them well. And I slowly began to understand that my own future had just changed in a very serious way. Thomas moved to the Bennett farm. Sarah's father offered him a position managing part of their land and made it very clear that Thomas's future now belonged with the Bennett family, not on a struggling homestead with his widowed sister. Thomas accepted the offer. He told me he would still help with our homestead. He promised he would come regularly to assist with the heavy work. He said he would never abandon the claim or leave me to manage it alone. He lied. Thomas came to the homestead only 3 times that winter, 3 times in 4 months. Each visit lasted barely an hour or 2, just long enough to look around and check on things before returning to the comfortable Bennett farm and his new wife. Each time he promised he would come more often. Each time he said he would help more. Each time he assured me he would not leave me to manage everything alone. Each time he broke that promise. By the spring of 1872, I was managing the homestead entirely by myself. I broke prairie sod alone, planted crops alone, repaired the house alone, and tended the livestock alone. Repaired the house alone, and tended the livestock alone. I had never intended to homestead by myself. I had come to Kansas to help Thomas with the understanding that he would help me in return. But Thomas was gone, and I was left with a quarter section of land that required constant labor and a house that needed a man's strength to maintain properly. I wrote to Thomas in April and told him I could not manage everything alone. I asked him to either come help me or allow me to return to Pennsylvania. He wrote back, telling me I should stay. He said the homestead was valuable and that I should hold on to it until he could return and help properly. He explained that his responsibilities to Sarah's family required his time for now, but soon he would be able to assist me again. That was another lie. Thomas never returned to help. He visited perhaps twice a year. These were brief visits where he would look around, tell me that I was doing well, and then leave again. He never offered help with the heavy work. He never sent money. He never admitted that he had brought me to Kansas with promises he never intended to keep. I struggled for 3 more years. From the spring of 1872 until the summer of 1875, I tried to maintain a homestead that truly required 2 adults to manage properly. I broke more sod, planted crops that sometimes grew and sometimes failed, endured winters alone in a sod house that leaked and froze, and faced the endless daily labor of trying to run a farm by myself. The work was far beyond what one woman should have attempted. Breaking prairie sod required a heavy plow and a team of oxen, work that demanded strength I did not truly possess. I learned to manage it only through stubborn determination and necessity. But the effort left me exhausted beyond measure. Every morning I woke with my back aching terribly, my hands cracked and bleeding from blisters that never had time to heal. My body protested constantly against work it had never been meant to endure. The first spring alone in 1872, I tried to break 10 additional acres. It took me 6 weeks of labor that should have taken a man 2 weeks with proper help. The plow was too heavy. The oxen were difficult to control alone. The untouched prairie sod resisted every effort to break it. I worked from dawn until darkness. Each night, I returned to the sod house barely able to move, and each morning I forced myself to rise and begin again. I planted wheat and corn that spring. I planted it alone and cared for it alone throughout the summer. The crop was smaller than it should have been because I simply could not mill and arges all the acres we had broken earlier. Some fields remained unplanted because I lacked the strength and time to work them. The harvest was modest, barely enough to save seed for the next year and produce a small income from the little surplus I could sell. But the loneliness was harder than the labor. Our nearest neighbor lived 5 miles away, a family I had met only twice in 2 years. Weeks sometimes passed without my seeing another human being, without speaking to anyone except myself. The prairie stretched empty in every direction. The silence was deep and heavy. I had grown up in a town where neighbors could be seen from the doorstep and where community was constant. The Kansas prairie offered no such comfort. The Kansas prairie offered no such comfort. It offered only endless grass, wide sky, and a loneliness that slowly pressed against the mind. I wrote letters to Thomas during that first year alone. I told him the work was too much. I reminded him that he had promised to help me. I told him that I needed him to keep that promise. His replies were always short and full of excuses. He said he was needed at the Bennett farm. He said he would help when he could. He told me to manage a little longer and that things would soon improve. Nothing improved. Thomas never returned to help beyond his brief visits twice a year, and those visits felt more like insults than assistance. He would arrive, walk around the property, say that I seemed to be doing well, and then leave without offering help with any of the heavy work waiting to be done. Repairs that required a man's strength were left undone. Improvements that required 2 people remained unfinished. Slowly the homestead began to look worn and neglected despite my efforts, because one woman alone could not maintain what 2 people had once built together. The second winter alone, from 1872 into 1873, I nearly died. The sod house roof leaked bly, and water and snow came through whenever the weather turned harsh. I tried to repair it myself, but did not have the strength to lift and place the heavy sod blocks properly. The house became cold, damp, and miserable. I spent that winter wrapped in blankets near the stove, trying simply to stay warm enough to survive. And before the winter was over, I began to run short. There was very little food left in February. The harvest had been smaller than what was needed. I had sold too much earlier just to get money for supplies, and the winter lasted longer than I had expected. I rationed everything carefully and ate only 1 small meal each day, watching my supplies slowly disappear. By March I was weak, thin, and desperate. Thomas did not come to visit that winter. No one came. I survived by myself, barely managing to keep going. During the second spring, in 1873, I did not break any new sod. Instead, I focused only on planting the acres that were already prepared, trying to maintain what existed instead of expanding. This was not how homesteading was supposed to work. A farmer was expected to improve constantly, to break more sod every year, and slowly expand the farm until it became fully productive. But I could not expand alone. I could only maintain what was already there, and even that was difficult. That summer brought drought. The crops struggled badly. Many of them failed completely. When the fall harvest came, it was even smaller than the year before. I sold what little I could, but prices were poor because the entire region had suffered from the same drought. I entered the third winter with less food and less money than I had started with. By the third year alone, from 1874 to 1875, I had changed physically. My hands were rough, calloused, and scarred, permanently damaged from work that was far too harsh for hands not raised to such labor. My back developed a constant ache that never truly left, a deep pain that woke me at night and never allowed full rest. I had lost weight that I could not afford to lose. I became thin, hard, and sharp in appearance. I looked at least 10 years older than my actual age of 25. My face was lined and weathered. My body bent from labor it had never been built to endure. But the biggest change was not physical. It was in my spirit. I became bitter. The optimism I had carried west from Pennsylvania disappeared. The hope that Thomas and I would build farms beside one another and prosper together died during those 3 long years. I learned that promises meant nothing, that family could not always be trusted, that I was alone, and would remain alone no matter what assurances had once been given. The bitterness grew each time Thomas made one of his short visits. He would arrive wearing clean clothes and driving a good wagon from the Bennett farm, looking comfortable and prosperous. He would walk slowly around the homestead and comment on what needed repair. He would suggest that I plant different crops or manage the animals in another way. Before we continue, a quick word. I have released 14 full recordings that will never appear on YouTube. These are voices that are too personal and too raw to share publicly, completely unedited with nothing removed. If you want access, the link is in the description. They are called the Lost Recordings, and getting them helps support the making of these videos. All right, now back to the story. After giving his advice, Thomas would leave again, returning to his comfortable life with Sarah's family, while I stayed behind, struggling alone. I stopped writing letters to him after the 2nd year. There was no point. He was not going to help me. He was not going to keep his promises. He was living the comfortable life he wanted, and my shrug clearly did not concern him. So I stopped asking for help. I worked by myself and waited for the 5 years to pass so I could file my own claim and finally have something that truly belonged to me. In July of 1875, 5 years after we had first filed the claim, Thomas came to the homestead again. I believed he had come to file the final proof that would complete the claim and secure ownership. I even thought that perhaps now he would help me file my own claim, as he had once promised. Instead, he told me he was selling the claim. He arrived on a Saturday morning driving the Bennett wagon and wearing good clothes that clearly showed his prosperity. I had been working in the field since dawn and was dirty and exhausted. When I saw him arrive without notice, I immediately felt suspicious. He rarely came anymore, and an unexpected visit meant something had changed. We sat inside the sod house, the same house I had patched and repaired by myself for 3 years, and Thomas explained his plans. He said a man named Stevens had offered good money for the improvements, for the house, the broken acres, the fences and the outbuildings. Thomas said the money would help him buy land near the Bennett farm. It would allow him and Sarah to establish their own place and begin their life properly. I asked him a simple question. What about me? What about the promise he had made 5 years earlier? What about the promise that I would file my own claim after helping him prove his? What about the 3 years I had spent maintaining this homestead alone, nearly working myself to death just to keep it alive? Thomas said he was sorry, but circumstances had changed. He said he had not known 5 years ago that he would marry into the Bennett family. He had not expected the opportunities that would come from that marriage. He reminded me that the claim had always been in his name, and that legally it was his property to sell whenever he chose. He said I should have understood that plans change, that nothing in life is certain, and that I should not have believed his promise was permanent. I reminded him of his exact words in Pennsylvania during the spring of 1870. He had said, "Help me prove my claim for 5 years, and then I will help you file your own claim on nearby land. We will be neighbors. We will help each other. We will build our farms side by side." Those had been his words, the promise that brought me all the way to Kansas. Thomas admitted he had said those things, but he claimed I should have known he might not be able to keep such a promise. He said circumstances beyond his control had changed everything, and that I was being unreasonable for holding him to words, spoken 5 years earlier when he had only been 17 years old. I told him that I had spent 3 full years working this homestead alone because he had abandoned it. I told him that the improvements Stevens wanted to buy were my work, not Thomas's. I told him he had lived comfortably with the Bennett family for 3.5 years, while I had nearly died maintaining his claim, and now he intended to sell my labor for his own profit. Thomas said that was not fair. He reminded me that he had filed the claim, that he had worked the land during the first 18 months, and that he had provided the initial investment that made the homestead possible. He said I had benefited from living there, that I had a home, when I had nowhere else to go, and that I had never been charged rent or asked to contribute money. He said I was acting as though I had done everything, when in reality I had only helped maintain what he had started. Thomas either could not understand or refused to understand that 3 years of hard labor, done alone, was worth far more than 18 months of shared labor at the beginning. He could not see that abandoning me for 3 years, while he lived comfortably, made his profit from my work a betrayal. Finally, Thomas said plainly what he had been suggesting all along. The claim was in his name. Under the law, he owned it and could sell it whenever he wished. I had no legal claim to the land or the improvements, no matter how much work I had done. He said he would give me some of the money from the sale, not half, because I had not paid half of the original costs, but enough to help me start somewhere else, enough to show that he was not abandoning me completely. He named a number, $200. It was less than half of what Stevens was paying and far less than 3 years of my labor were worth. I asked how much Stevens was paying in total. Thomas answered, $500 for the improvements. I told him then to give me half, $250, which seemed like fair payment for my work. Thomas refused. He said that was too much, and that he needed most of the money to establish his own farm. He said $200 was already generous, and that many men in his position would give their helper nothing at all. At that moment, I realized something painful. Thomas did not see me as a sister who had trusted his promise. He saw me as a hired worker. He viewed my 3 years of labor as employment, not as a shared family effort meant to benefit both of us. He truly believed that $200 was generous payment for 3 years of farm labor. He did not understand that I had worked those years, believing I was building my own claim and my own future, not working as his paid laborer. I told him I would not leave. The claim might be in his name, but I had maintained it alone for 3 years. I had broken the sod, planted the crops, and made the improv. The mint Stevens now wanted to buy. The claim would never have survived without my labor, and I would not simply walk away so Thomas could profit from work I believed was building my future. Thomas stood up and looked at me with something that almost resembled pity. He said, I was being foolish. He said Stevens would take possession whether I left willingly or not. If I refused to leave, Stevens could ask the law to remove me, and I would receive nothing at all. He told me I should accept the $200 and start somewhere else, because this was the best outcome I was likely to get. I answered that I would rather have nothing than accept money that pretended to pay for 3 years of brutal labor. I said $200 was an insult, just Thomas trying to ease his conscience while taking what belonged to me. I told him he could keep his blood money and live with the knowledge that he had brought his widowed sister to Kansas with promises he never truly intended to keep. Thomas said I was being dramatic and unreasonable. He insisted he had not known 5 years earlier what would happen, that circumstances had changed, and that I needed to adapt to reality instead of clinging to old promises. He said he was sorry I was disappointed, but life required flexibility, and I was making everything harder than it needed to be. He left that day without settling anything. He said he would return in 2 weeks with Stevens to finalize the sale. I should be ready to leave by then. The $200 would be waiting if I wanted it, but the amount would not increase. I could accept it or take nothing. After he left, I walked slowly through the fields I'd planted. I looked over the acres I had broken with my own hands, the crops I had cared for through 3 long growing seasons, the improvements I had made just to keep the homestead alive. Every foot of that land, the sod house I had patched again and again, the fences I had repaired, the well I had maintained, dot fields I had planted and gathered from the soil. 3 long years of hard work that had aged me far beyond my time, years that had scarred my hands, bent my back, and worn down my body. And Thomas was planning to sell it for $500, hand me only $200 of it, and still believe he was being generous. In that moment, I finally understood that I had been a fool. I had trusted family promises. I had believed that Thomas would help me just as he had said he would. I had spent 3 years caring for his claim, because I believed I was slowly building a future for myself. But in truth, I had been nothing more than unpaid labor, a useful helper, while Thomas worked to establish himself with a wealthy family. The truth became painfully clear. Thomas had never truly planned to help me file my own claim. That promise had simply been bait to bring me west, to convince me to work his land while he chased other chances. Once he married into the Bennett family, once he had better options than struggling on a lonely homestead with his widowed sister, he abandoned both the claim and every promise he had made, and now he was selling the claim I had cared for, taking the profit from the work I had done, offering me a small and insulting share of what my labor had been worth, and believing he was generous for doing it. I refused his money. When Thomas returned 2 weeks later with Stevens, I told him I would take nothing from the sale. I said I would not accept blood money. I would not allow him to ease his conscience by giving me a tiny piece of what he truly owed me. I told him he could keep the entire $500 and live with the knowledge that he had stolen from his own sister. Thomas said I was acting foolish. He said I needed the money and that pride was expensive. I answered there. Pride was expensive. Yes, but I had already paid far more costly prices than pride during the last 3 years. I had paid with my body, my health, and my youth. I had paid with 3 full years of my life, believing I was building a future. Thomas's $200 could never buy back what I had lost, so I would rather have nothing than pretend that it could. Thomas tried to insist. He tried to push the money on me, almost as if forcing it would make everything right. I refused again and again. Finally, he stopped arguing, put the money back in his pocket, and went to finish the sale with Stevens. The claim was sold in August of 1875. Stevens took possession in September, and I left the homestead that I had cared for alone for 3 long years, the sod house I had patched and repaired through 3 cruel winters, the fields I had planted and harvested by myself, and I walked away with nothing. I had nowhere to go, no clear prospects, and no future waiting for me. I was 26 years old. I had been a widow for 5 years. I had spent 3 of those years doing brutal farm labor on a Kansas homestead, believing I was building toward my own claim, believing in my brother's promises, and in the end I was left with nothing except bitterness and the hard understanding that family loyalty often means nothing when money and convenience enter the picture. I did not return to Pennsylvania. I could not face going back there having failed, having been abandoned by the brother who had promised to help me build a future. Instead, I found work in the small Kansas settlements, taking whatever employment I could get. I worked as a dressmaker, as a cook, as a hired woman, doing whatever labor people were willing to pay for. The work was difficult, but it was not as hard as homesteading had been. At least I was earning wages. I was no longer working for promises that would be broken. Read again in 1879. 4 years after leaving the homestead, he was a widower with 3 children, a man who needed a wife and a mother for his household more than he needed a companion. His name was Robert Hayes. He was 16 years older than me, and our marriage was practical rather than loving. But Robert was an honest man. He did not make promises he could not keep. After Thomas's betrayal, honesty mattered more to me than affection. Robert and I had 2 children together. We raised his 3 children as well, and our family slowly built a modest life in Kansas. Robert died in 1902. After his death, I continued living in Kansas. I was never wealthy, but I was never desperate either. I was never again dependent on family because I had learned not to trust family promises. Thomas, meanwhile, prospered with the Bennett family. He and Sarah had 4 children. They built a successful farming operation and became respected people in their community. Thomas never lacked for comfort after he married into the Bennett family. The money he gained from selling our homestead helped him start his own farm. The farm he built partly on the labor I had given for 3 years. The $500 from that sale, my 3 years of work turned into cash, bought Thomas the seed and equipment he needed for his first year farming near the Bennett land. He used my labor to establish himself. He used my broken body to build his prosperity, and he lived comfortably and respected for 43 years after selling the claim I had maintained. Over the years, I saw Thomas occasionally, family gatherings, funerals, moments that could not be avoided. We were polite to each other, but never close again. Thomas seemed to believe that I should have forgiven him, that enough time had passed to make what he did unimportant. He never understood that some betrayals never truly heal, that abandoning your sister after bringing her to Kansas with promises of help is not something time simply erases. At a family funeral in 1883, 8 years after he sold the homestead, Thomas approached me and said he hoped I was doing well. He asked about my husband and my children. He spoke casually, making small talk, behaving as if nothing serious stood between us. I answered politely but briefly. I gave him no opening to speak about the past and moved away as soon as manners allowed. He tried again in 1890, 15 years after the sale. He said he had been thinking about the old days in Kansas. He said he hoped I understood that he had only done what he believed was best at the time. He explained that he had been young and had not handled things perfectly, but he hoped I could see that everything had worked out. He had his family and his farm. I had my family and my home. According to him, we had both built good lives, despite the difficulties. I told him I was glad his life had worked out well. I did not tell him that his comfortable life had been built partly on my stolen labor, that his prosperity had been purchased with my broken health. He had no right to speak about difficulties when the hardships had been mine alone, while he lived comfortably. I simply told him I was glad he was successful, and then I walked away. Thomas never truly apologized. He never admitted that bringing me to Kansas with promises he never planned to keep had been wrong. He never acknowledged that leaving me to 3 years of lonely labor was betrayal. He never recognized that selling the claim I had maintained and keeping almost all the profit was theft. He simply believed that time would heal everything, that I would forgive him because we were family, that blood alone meant automatic forgiveness. He believed wrong. I never forgave him. Not because I enjoyed anger, and not because I could not move on with my life, but because what Thomas had done deserved a lifetime of anger. He had looked me in the eyes in Pennsylvania and promised to help me build a future in Kansas. He had brought me west with those promises. Then he had abandoned them the moment something better appeared. He had left me struggling alone, profited from my labor, and believed that offering me a small payment made everything acceptable. For many years I watched Thomas's life from a distance. I heard news about his children's achievements, about the success of his farm, about his respected place in the community. I heard that he and Sarah celebrated their 30th anniversary in 1901 and their 40th in 1911. I heard that his children married well and that his grandchildren were many and thriving, and every piece of news about Thomas's prosperity reminded me that his comfortable life had been built partly on my 3 years of brutal labor. The seed money that started his farm came from selling the homestead I had maintained. His children's opportunities came from wealth built partly on work I had done believing I was creating my own future. His comfortable old age had been purchased partly with my youth, my health, and 3 years of my life. I did not envy Thomas's happiness with Sarah. I did not resent his marriage or his children. What I resented was that he had broken his promises in order to reach that happiness. He had abandoned me to achieve that happiness. He had abandoned me to achieve that success. He had profited from my labor to build that prosperity, and he had never once admitted that what he did had been wrong. Thomas died in 1918 at 65 years old, surrounded by family who loved him. He died comfortable, respected, and successful. His obituary listed his accomplishments. It described him as a successful farmer, a devoted husband, a loving father, and a respected member of the community. It listed his survivors, his wife of 46 years, his 4 children, and many grandchildren. It praised his character, his work ethic, and his contributions to the town. The obituary did not mention that he had brought his widowed sister to Kansas in 1870 with promises to help her build a future. It did not mention that he had abandoned her 18 months later after marrying into wealth. It did not mention that she had maintained his homestead claim alone for 3 years while he lived comfortably elsewhere. It did not mention that he had sold that claim in 1875 and kept most of the profit from her labor, leaving her with nothing after 3 years of work that had aged her a decade and damaged her health. I attended Thomas's funeral. I stood among the family, listened as people spoke about his virtues, and watched his grandchildren cry for the grandfather who had loved them, and I felt nothing except the same anger I had carried for 43 years. People expected me to grieve. After all, we had once been close as children. We had come west together. We were family tied by blood and shared history. But grief requires loss, and I had lost Thomas long ago in December of 1871, when he married Sarah and abandoned our homestead. The man who died in 1918 was not the brother I had known in Pennsylvania. That brother had disappeared 57 years earlier. In his place had stood a man who broke promises, profited from betrayal, and lived comfortably while his sister carried the memory of what he had done. After the funeral, Sarah spoke to me. She was 77 years old and had been married to Thomas for 46 years. She had built a good life with him. She said she knew Thomas and I had grown distant over the years. She said she hoped I would remember the good times rather than the bitterness that had come later, than whatever arguments had come between us. She said Thomas had spoken warmly of me in his later years and had said he wished we had stayed closer. I told Sarah that I remembered Thomas well. I did not tell her that the memories I carried were filled with betrayal and broken promises. I did not tell her that her comfortable 46 years of marriage had been built partly on my 3 years of hard labor, keeping a homestead running that Thomas later sold for profit. I did not tell her that Thomas's kind words were cheap and empty compared to the promises he had broken and the work he had taken from me. I left the funeral holding the same anger I had arrived with. Thomas's death changed nothing. It did not erase what he had done. It did not make his betrayal easier to forgive. It only meant he had died comfortable, believing I had forgiven him, or at least moved on, never knowing that I had carried fury for his betrayal every single day for 43 years. I am 74 years old now. I have lived in Kansas for 53 years, longer than I ever lived in Pennsylvania. Kansas is my home, even though I came here under false promises and stayed because I had nowhere else to go. I built a life here, raised children here, endured hardship, and survived and grew old here. But I have never forgiven Thomas, not for bringing me here, because that part was my choice, but for leaving me behind after he brought me, for breaking his promises, for gaining profit from my labor, for treating family loyalty like something that could be thrown away whenever it became inconvenient. Thomas believed his marriage to Sarah justified leaving our homestead behind. He believed I should understand that his new family came before his promises to me. Maybe I should have understood that. Maybe family loyalty is supposed to be flexible, supposed to bend when life changes, supposed to be forgiven when better opportunities appear. But I do not believe promises should be broken so easily. When Thomas asked me to come to Kansas, he promised we would build farms side by side, and that he would help me establish my own claim. I came to Kansas trusting those promises. I worked for 3 years, believing I was building my own future, believing Thomas would keep his word. He did not keep his word. He left me the moment a better opportunity appeared. He sold the homestead I had maintained for 3 years, took the money from my labor, and went on to live a comfortable life while I was left with nothing. That is what I have carried for 48 years. Not anger that Thomas married well, not resentment that he became prosperous, but fury that he broke his promises, abandoned me to struggle alone, gained profit from my work, and never once admitted that what he did was wrong. People say I should have moved on. They say I should have forgiven Thomas before he died, that I should not hold anger for nearly 50 years. But those people did not work alone on a Kansas homestead for 3 years, believing they were building a future. They did not watch their brother sell that future for profit. They did not learn that family promises can mean nothing when convenience requires breaking them. I survived Thomas's abandonment. I married again, raised children, built a life, but I never forgot, and I never forgot, and I never forgo. And I will carry that anger to my grave, because some betrayals are too deep to forgive. Some broken promises are too important to forget. Thomas died believing time had healed the damage he caused. He died thinking I had forgiven him, or that my lack of forgiveness was only stubborn pride. He died comfortable and respected, and surrounded by family who loved him. And I am glad he died believing I had forgiven him, because the truth, that his sister spent nearly 50 years furious at his betrayal, would have disturbed his peaceful death, and he did not deserve an easy ending. He deserved to know that what he did mattered, that abandoning family had consequences, that I remembered every promise he broke, and every year I struggled alone because he valued his wife's family more than his sister. But I said nothing. Thomas died peacefully, and I have carried this anger alone for 48 years. I will carry it a few more years, until my own death, because anger is all I have left of the future Thomas promised me, and then sold for his own profit. To Thomas's children, your father was a good man to you. He provided well, loved you, and built you a comfortable inheritance. But your prosperity was built partly on my labor. On 3 years I spent maintaining a homestead. Your father later sold, without fairly compensating me for the work I had done. Your father was good to his family. He was not good to me. To anyone reading this, be careful whose promises you trust. Family promises are sometimes the easiest to break, because family assumes forgiveness will always come. Thomas believed I would forgive him for abandoning me in Kansas, for breaking his promises, for profiting from my labor. He believed wrong. Some betrayals run too deep to forgive. Some broken promises are too serious to forget. I came to Kansas 53 years ago, trusting my brother's word. I stayed in Kansas because after he betrayed me, I had nowhere else to go. I built a life here despite him, not because of him. I have spent 48 years, angry that I trusted him, angry that he broke his promises, angry that he prospered from my labor and never admitted what he took from me. That anger has kept me alert and strong. That anger has reminded me not to trust promises, not to depend too much on family, not to believe that people will keep their word simply because they share your blood. Thomas taught me that family loyalty can be conditional, that promises can be thrown away, that people may abandon you when a better opportunity appears. I learned that lesson well. I survived because I stopped trusting so easily. And I am growing old with anger, because some betrayals deserve lifelong fury. Over the years, some people have told me that carrying anger for so long is unhealthy, that forgiveness would give me peace, that I should release the past and focus on the good life I built, despite Thomas's betrayal. These people mean well, but they do not understand. The anger is not destroying me. The anger is what kept me going. The anger reminds me that I survived, that I built a life after being abandoned, that I became stronger than the brother who thought selling me out for $500 was acceptable. Thomas died comfortable because he never had to face the real consequences of his betrayal. He lived 43 years after selling the homestead. He prospered on money my labor made possible. He died surrounded by family who thought well of him. He died believing I had moved on, believing time had healed whatever damage he caused, believing we were simply siblings who had grown distant with time. He died wrong. I never moved on. I never healed. I carried fury for his betrayal every single day for 48 years, and I am glad he never knew. Because if he had known, if he had understood that his comfortable life was shadowed by his sister's permanent rage, it might have troubled him, and he deserved to be troubled. He deserved to know that breaking promises leaves lasting consequences, that abandoning family matters, that I remembered every lie he told, and every promise he broke, but I said nothing. Thomas died peaceful, and I have carried this anger alone. I will carry it to my own death, because this anger is mine, earned through 3 years of brutal labor on a Kansas homestay, paid for with my youth and my health, and the future Thomas promised me, and then sold. People say family is everything. They say blood is thicker than water, and that we should forgive family because family is all we truly have. I say family deserves no special forgiveness. Family should be held to the same standards as anyone else. Keep your promises. Honor your responsibilities. Do not exploit those who trust you. Thomas failed every one of those standards. The fact that he was my brother makes it worse, not better. I am 74 years old now. I have lived in Kansas for 53 years, longer than I lived anywhere else. I raised stepchildren and my own children here. I buried a second husband here. I grew old here. Kansas is my home, but it is a home built on betrayal, anger, and the determination to survive even after being abandoned. And every word of it is true.